A woman tied to a chair, forcibly injected with fentanyl until she overdoses. This isn't a scene from a horror movie. It's a real torture method used by the Sinaloa cartel's Chapitos. The U.S. Department of Justice recently revealed this and other shocking tactics in their indictment against the sons of El Chapo. The Justice Department's charges against Ivan, Alfredo, Joaquin, and Ovidio Guzman Lopez expose a world of brutality that goes beyond what most people can imagine. These cartel leaders, known as the Chapitos, have taken their father's criminal empire to new levels of cruelty.
The Chapitos pioneered the manufacture and trafficking of the deadliest drug our country has ever faced. And they are responsible for the massive influx of fentanyl into the United States.
But the fentanyl injection method is just the tip of the iceberg. The indictments unveil even more horrifying torture techniques used by the cartel, from feeding victims to tigers to using machine guns in ways you wouldn't believe. The Chapitos have created a reign of terror that's hard to comprehend. Stick around as we reveal the full extent of their brutal methods and how the U.S. is fighting back. The Chapitos didn't become the most feared cartel leaders overnight. Their rise to power is a story of ruthless ambition and calculated violence. Let's take a closer look at the sons of Joaquin, El Chapo Guzman, the heirs to his bloody empire. When El Chapo was finally locked away for good, many thought the Sinaloa cartel would crumble, but his sons had other plans. They stepped up to fill the power vacuum, determined to prove they were just as brutal and cunning as their father. There are four main players in this new generation of cartel leadership: Ivan Archivaldo Guzman Salazar, Jesus Alfredo Guzman Salazar, Joaquin Guzman Lopez, and Ovidio Guzman Lopez. Each has carved out their own role in the family business, but it's their combined efforts that have turned the Sinaloa cartel into what the U.S. government calls the most prolific and violent fentanyl trafficking operation in the world. Let's break down who these guys are and what they're accused of. First up is Ivan Archivaldo, also known as El Chapito. He's the big boss when it comes to making and moving fentanyl and other drugs. The U.S. Justice Department says he's the one calling the shots on the cartel's day-to-day operations. Then there's Jesus Alfredo. He works closely with his brother Ivan to keep the drug empire running smoothly. The two of them are known for their innovative and brutal tactics to maintain control. Joaquin Guzman Lopez is the third brother named in the indictments. While less is known about his specific role, he's still considered a key player in the cartel's operations. Last but not least is Ovidio Guzman Lopez. He made headlines earlier this year when Mexican military officials arrested him. Ovidio is said to be in charge of a major part of the cartel's fentanyl business. Together, these four have taken their father's legacy to new heights or depths, depending on how you look at it. Attorney General Merrick Garland didn't mince words when he said, "The Chapitos control this global criminal enterprise, and they use ruthless violence to protect it."
Operators of the clandestine labs in Mexico, where the cartel manufactures fentanyl, a weapons supplier who arms the cartel with firearms smuggled into Mexico from the United States, leaders of the cartel's security forces who terrorize communities, money launderers who enable the cartel to fund its operations, and the cartel's leaders, known as the Chapitos, who are sons of the now imprisoned former head of the cartel, known as El Chapo. The 23 defendants we have charged in this indictment represent each stage of the movement, manufacturing, and sale of deadly fentanyl from start to finish.
And ruthless they are. The Chapitos have a reputation for using extreme violence to keep their empire in check. They've got a private army of security forces that aren't afraid to attack law enforcement, intimidate civilians, and destroy any businesses that don't play ball. But it's not just rival gangs and uncooperative businesses that face their wrath. The Chapitos have been charged with some truly horrific crimes against law enforcement too. In one case, they allegedly tortured a Mexican police officer for 2 hours before Ivan Archivaldo personally shot him. Even with El Chapo behind bars, his sons have managed to not only keep the Sinaloa cartel alive, but make it more powerful and more violent than ever before. Their control over the global fentanyl trade has brought them enormous wealth and influence, but it's also put them squarely in the crosshairs of U.S. law enforcement. As we dive deeper into the brutal methods used by the Chapitos, remember that these aren't just stories. These are real crimes with real victims. both in Mexico and in communities across the United States devastated by the flood of fentanyl pouring across the border. The Chapitos aren't just drug lords, they're masters of terror, and one of their most shocking tactics, using tigers and lions as tools of torture and disposal. Yeah, you heard that right. Attorney General Merrick Garland dropped this bombshell during the announcement of the indictments. He said they have fed some of their victims, dead and alive, to tigers belonging to the Chapitos. Imagine being a victim, knowing you might end up as a tiger's next meal. Or worse, watching it happen to someone else, knowing you could be next. It's psychological warfare at its most brutal. This method isn't just about inflicting pain, it's a two-for-one deal for the cartel. First, it's an extreme form of torture. The fear alone is enough to break most people, but it's also a clever way to get rid of bodies. Tigers don't leave much evidence behind. The use of live animals for torture isn't new, but the Chapitos have taken it to a whole new level. Think about it. If you're a rival gang member, a snitch, or just someone who owes the cartel money, knowing that tigers are on the menu, but it's not just about the victims. This kind of brutality affects everyone who hears about it. It spreads fear like wildfire. People in cartel-controlled areas live in constant terror, never knowing if they or their loved ones might end up as tiger food. The psychological impact of this method is huge. For the victims, it's unimaginable terror. For witnesses, it's trauma that'll likely haunt them for life. And for the general public, it's a stark reminder of the cartel's power and ruthlessness. You've heard about the tigers, but the Chapitos have more tricks up their sleeves. Some of their methods might sound familiar, but trust me, they've put their own twisted spin on them. Let's talk about two classics they've brought into the 21st century: electrocution and waterboarding. Electrocution isn't new in the world of torture, but the Sinaloa cartel has turned it into an art form. They use it to get information, punish people who cross them, or just to spread fear. Picture this: a person strapped to a chair, wires attached to sensitive parts of their body. Then, the electricity starts flowing. The pain is unimaginable, and the damage can be severe or even fatal. But the Chapitos don't stop there. They've taken waterboarding and cranked it up to 11. This technique involves restraining someone, covering their face with cloth or plastic, and pouring water over it. It creates the feeling of drowning. It's terrifying, and it can break even the toughest person. The cartel uses waterboarding to scare people into talking. What makes these methods even worse is how the cartel amplifies them. They don't just torture one person at a time. Sometimes they'll make other people watch. The Chapitos also like to mix and match their torture methods. They might start with electrocution, then move on to waterboarding, and then threaten to feed you to the tigers we talked about earlier. Attorney General Merrick Garland emphasized how cruel the cartel can be. He talked about them feeding people to tigers, both dead and alive. This shows how far they're willing to go to maintain control. These torture methods aren't just about causing pain. They're about sending a message. The Chapitos want everyone to know what happens to people who cross them. It's a strategy of terror designed to keep their empire intact. As brutal as these methods are, they're just part of the Chapitos' arsenal. They've got even more horrifying techniques up their sleeves. And as we'll see next, they're not afraid to use modern technology to inflict pain in new and terrifying ways. You thought feeding people to tigers was bad. The Chapitos have an even more brutal method up their sleeves, one that combines raw firepower with psychological terror. I'm talking about their machine gun torture technique. This isn't your typical execution by firing squad. The Chapitos have turned machine guns into tools of prolonged agony. They shoot their victims at close range, but not to kill them quickly. Instead, they aim to inflict maximum pain and fear. Picture this: a person tied up, unable to move. A gunman stands just a few feet away with a powerful .50 caliber machine gun. The victim knows what's coming, but they don't know when or where the bullets will hit. Think about it. The sound alone of a machine gun firing that close would be deafening. The muzzle flash, the smell of gunpowder, the impact of bullets tearing into flesh. But here's the twisted part. The gunmen are skilled enough to keep their victims alive. They might shoot off limbs or create other devastating injuries, but they don't let death come too quickly. It's torture in its purest form. This method serves two purposes for the cartel. First, it's used to extract information. The threat of being shot, combined with the pain of actual wounds, can make people talk. Second, it's a way to send a message. Anyone who crosses the Chapitos knows this could be their fate. The psychological impact of this torture method is huge. Even if someone survives, they're likely to be traumatized for life. And for those forced to watch, the mental scars can be just as deep as any physical wound. Remember how we talked about the Chapitos using machine guns and tigers? Well, they've got another weapon in their torture arsenal, one that's killing thousands of Americans every day: fentanyl. This drug isn't just their biggest moneymaker, it's also become one of their most brutal tools for torture and intimidation. The U.S. Department of Justice recently dropped a bombshell. They revealed that the Chapitos have been using fentanyl to torture people in ways that'll make your skin crawl. We're not just talking about forcing addicts to take the drug. No, this is way more sinister.
These are people who gave fentanyl to a man, watched him die, and then sent that same batch of fentanyl to the United States.
Picture this: a person tied down, unable to move. Cartel members standing over them with syringes full of fentanyl. They start injecting the victim over and over, watching to see how much it takes before they overdose. It's like something out of a horror movie, but it's happening in real life. Attorney General Merrick Garland laid it all out. He said the cartel would tie people down and inject them with fentanyl until they died. They weren't just killing these people, they were using them as human lab rats to test how strong their product was. In one case, they did this to a woman. They kept injecting her with fentanyl over and over until she finally overdosed and died. Can you imagine the terror she must have felt? Knowing that each injection could be her last, but being powerless to stop it? But here's the really sick part. Even after someone died from testing a batch of fentanyl, the cartel would still send that same batch to the US. They didn't care that they knew it was strong enough to kill. All they cared about was making money. This torture method isn't just about causing pain or getting information. It's part of the Chapitos' twisted quality control process for their drug empire. They're using human beings as disposable test subjects to make sure their product is potent enough to keep their customers hooked.
Today's indictments name several sons of convicted drug lord Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the so-called Chapitos, known for their brutality.
To dominate the fentanyl supply chain, the Chapitos kill, kidnap, and torture anyone who gets in the way.
The Chapitos aren't just masters of torture, they're running a global fentanyl empire that's flooding the streets of America with deadly drugs. The U.S. Department of Justice calls it the largest, most violent, and most prolific fentanyl trafficking operation in the world. But how did they build this massive drug network? And who's helping them do it? It all starts in China. The Sinaloa cartel has teamed up with Chinese chemical companies to get the ingredients they need to make fentanyl. These companies ship precursor chemicals to Mexico, where the cartel turns them into the deadly drug that's killing thousands of Americans every day. Attorney General Merrick Garland didn't mince words about this partnership. He said, "That operation is run by the Sinaloa cartel and fueled by Chinese precursor chemical and pharmaceutical companies. It's a global supply chain of death, stretching from Asia to North America. But getting the chemicals is just the first step. The Chapitos have set up a network of secret labs across Mexico where they manufacture fentanyl on an industrial scale. These aren't small-time operations. We're talking about factories churning out millions of pills every day. Once the fentanyl is made, the cartel has to get it into the US, and they've got some pretty creative ways of doing it. They use submarines to sneak drugs past coast guards. They fly planes loaded with fentanyl across the border. They dig tunnels under the desert to smuggle their product into America. The Sinaloa cartel's fentanyl empire is like a deadly octopus, with tentacles reaching into every corner of the globe. From Chinese chemical labs to Mexican manufacturing plants to American street corners, they've created a network that's as efficient as it is lethal. The US government isn't just sitting back and watching the Chapitos run their empire of terror. They're hitting back hard, and they're not pulling any punches. On April 14th, 2023, the Department of Justice dropped a bombshell. They unsealed major indictments against the leaders of the Sinaloa cartel, targeting the sons of El Chapo himself. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. We're talking about serious charges that could put these guys away for life. So what exactly are these guys charged with? It's a long list. Drug trafficking is the big one, of course. The Justice Department says the Chapitos are running the largest, most violent, and most prolific fentanyl trafficking operation in the world. These aren't just vague accusations. The indictments spell out specific crimes. The Chapitos are charged with importing and distributing massive amounts of fentanyl. They're accused of possessing machine guns and other destructive devices, and they're said to have laundered billions of dollars in drug money. Attorney General Merrick Garland didn't mince words when he announced the charges. He said, "Today's indictments reflect the Justice Department's commitment to attacking every aspect of that threat and the cartels that drive it. This isn't just about catching a few drug dealers. It's about taking down an entire criminal organization. But the Justice Department isn't working alone. This is a coordinated effort involving multiple federal agencies." Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco highlighted this teamwork. She said, "Working together across the government, with the private sector, and using every available tool, we will defeat these cartels." It's a full-court press against the Chapitos and their associates. And it's not just about arrests and indictments. The U.S. is going after the cartel's money too. The Treasury Department has announced sanctions against 2 Chinese companies and 5 individuals for selling fentanyl precursors to the Sinaloa cartel. This cuts off a key part of their supply chain. The Justice Department is also working with Mexican authorities to extradite key cartel members. But here's the kicker. These indictments aren't just about punishing criminals. They're about saving lives. Attorney General Garland pointed out that from August 2021 to August 2022, 107,735 people died of drug overdoses in the U.S. 2/3 of those deaths involved synthetic opioids like fentanyl. By taking down the Chapitos and their fentanyl empire, the Justice Department hopes to stop this deadly flow of drugs into American communities. It's a huge task, but they're throwing everything they've got at it. We've seen how brutal the Chapitos can be, but their real weapon of mass destruction isn't tigers or machine guns. It's fentanyl. This synthetic opioid is tearing through America like wildfire, leaving a trail of addiction and death in its wake. But it gets worse. Between 2019 and 2021, fatal overdoses in America shot up by about 94%. That means nearly 200 Americans are dying every single day from fentanyl poisoning. It's not just addicts either. Many victims are first-time users who had no idea they were taking fentanyl. DEA Administrator Milgram put it bluntly, "Every day, we at DEA hear devastating stories of Americans who took a pill thinking it was a legitimate prescription medication, not knowing that there was fentanyl inside, and they died." This crisis is hitting young Americans especially hard. Fentanyl is now the leading cause of death for Americans between 18 and 45. It's killing more people in this age group than terrorism, car accidents, cancer, and even COVID-19. And it's not just adults. The number of children under 14 dying from fentanyl is skyrocketing. These aren't teens experimenting with drugs. We're talking about kids accidentally getting their hands on pills that look like candy. The DEA is working overtime to stop this flood of death. In 2022, they seized more than 50.6 million fake prescription pills laced with fentanyl. That's more than double what they grabbed in 2021. They also nabbed over 10,000 pounds of fentanyl powder. Let that sink in for a second. Those seizures represent more than 379 million potentially deadly doses of fentanyl. That's enough to kill every single person in America. And remember, that's just what they managed to catch. Who knows how much is still out there? Deputy Attorney General Monaco didn't mince words about the scale of this crisis. She said, "The fentanyl crisis in America, fueled in large part by the Sinaloa cartel, threatens our public health, our public safety, and our national security. This isn't just about numbers on a page. It's about real people, real families torn apart by this epidemic. It's about communities across America struggling to cope with the devastating impact of fentanyl addiction and overdose deaths. The Chapitos and their fentanyl empire are at the heart of this crisis. They've pioneered the manufacture and trafficking of this deadly drug, flooding American streets with pills that can kill with just one dose. And as we've seen, they're not afraid to use the most brutal methods to keep their operation running." The U.S. isn't just sitting back and watching the cartels run wild. They're gearing up for a major fight against the Chapitos and their brutal empire. The Justice Department is pulling out all the stops, using every tool they've got to take down these drug lords. It's not just about arresting a few kingpins. The feds are going after the whole operation, from the Chinese companies supplying chemicals to the money launderers cleaning their cash. They're even working with tech companies to track crypto transactions tied to the cartel. But here's the big question: will it be enough? The Sinaloa cartel has survived takedowns before. Remember when they caught El Chapo? His sons just stepped up and kept the machine running. The Justice Department knows this fight won't be easy or quick. They're in it for the long haul, determined to dismantle the cartel piece by piece.